So particularly helped my eldest daughter make it through some really rough times recently. So we owe her a lot. So I'm from Australia, moved over to Philadelphia in 1992, worked for Young Life in youth ministry, mostly focused on outreach through the community south of here, closer to where K&A site is. Got involved in community development from there, began working, helping youth build programs and looking at kind of the expansive idea of community rather than just maybe what we'd seen as direct community ministry. Worked in a church, Bethel Temple, which has been a partner for Esperanza for a long time as well, on Allegheny. And then in about 2004, I moved to working for a church on Wyoming Avenue, just up here next community over Feltonville. Which wasn't such a great experience, trying to get a church to transform from being an older white congregation into being kind of more interactive into its community as community transformation came through. Did that and then got into consulting, mostly consulting with churches and non-profits around how to work within core communities. Began teaching maybe about 10 years ago at a place called CUTS, Center for Urban Theological Studies, which has been the primary training ground for the African-American pastorate at the city, and then worked for Cairn University for the last 7 years full-time, directing a program there in urban ministry, and then for the last couple of years running the Center for Urban Engagement. So I do that. I teach some classes, mostly sociocultural studies, intercultural studies, those kinds of things at the university. Married to Joyce. Joyce came out of Eastern University. She's from Central PA. She worked for a group called EAPE and was a school teacher in Southwest Philly. She's back teaching again. She teaches at the city school in the Fairmount section of Philadelphia. She's a kindergarten first grade teacher. So she's been working longer than I have in the city. And then we have 4 children. Our oldest daughter, Saye, is in Central PA. She's 22. We have a daughter, Melanie, who's in university. And another daughter, Emma, who just finished high school. Quite anticlimactic. And you have relatives who just finished. So she's trying to figure out, she's got accepted into Australian University, so she's trying to figure out what to do. And then my son is 11, and he's just going into year 7. And he goes to, they've all gone to bilingual school up until high school. So they're all fluent in Spanish. We live in the Frankfurt section, which, if you don't know, Philly is the next, I guess 2 communities over, closer to the river. We live just off the L. So my kids are all city kids. I'm a country person. I still prefer country, rural, where I can't see people. We've laughed a lot about social distancing. I'm sure some of you have got different feelings on this. You know, when I come into here and into this place, I've got to be more expressive about keeping a distance to my friends who want to come up and hug and be right in my face. But this distance is good for me. Like I'm good all my life with people being further away from me. It's hard to say. I guess I often speak on short-term missions and the negative impacts it's had on communities. If you have questions about community dynamics, or we see things taking place, that kind of thing, please at any point stop and ask. I never set out to offend people or say things that are hard or others, but if Lizzie would attest, people who've been through my program, it's usually a pretty hard journey from those who coming from outside an urban community into the city about maybe some of the dynamics that we see from this point of view. So I thought maybe I could start with a little about this. I mean, we're in some pretty tense times, and whether you're in the city or out of the city, it's been pretty tense recently. And maybe some of the churches' interactions or lack of interactions in those times, and how that plays into, for some of you coming in or being in a mixed group of some who've come from the city and some who from outside the city, and how to understand those dynamics. So I usually begin with the idea that I think God has created all people in His image, which is something that we seem to say a lot but don't often act out on. So that every person that we come across and interact with is created in the image of God, which makes him an amazing person. Right? How could it get any better than that? And so people that live in these communities, although there's some poverty, and at this point there's some extreme poverty in some sections of the community, that these are God's image bearers who are gifted to conduct God's work. And as the church has evolved in the US, I think more and more in recent times, it reflects the culture a lot more than it reflects Christ, particularly the churches I think outside the city. And so that often makes it difficult that we put a really high value, high status on societal gifts more so than Christian gifts. And that, I think, is some of the divide that we're seeing at the moment come out. It is a cultural divide more so than a faith divide. So I've lived, so I'm into my 28th year in the city. I come from this point, I guess, of privilege of having choices where I live. I could move out of the city, I could move back to Australia, I could raise my kids in other places. And we've chosen to live in the city and live in the part of the city we do because we think that it's just a better place to raise our kids. And it's a better environment, and it's a safer environment. And we found that often the impression of these communities has been that they're unsafe, or that they're not good places to raise your kids, or they're not a healthy place to be in. And that's what began this movement of people outside Philadelphia. So, Philly topped out population in the 1970s, or topped out in the 1950s and maintained a population of about 2 million. And then from 80 to 90, it lost 500,000 people in that population. So it declined quite quickly, which is why you see a lot of the abandonment in that movement. And that movement was led by white people moving out of the city, particularly Christians, were a high rate of the movement out of the city, and this idea of the city is a bad place and outside is a good place. And hence we created these suburbs. And the church was a big part of the creation of the suburbs. And really the abandonment of the city. Once churches left the city, white churches, they had very little to do with what goes on in the city after that. So we've had this impression and this kind of lasting thing because we've valued certain things in society. So we valued space, right? Having a space, or, right now, peace. Having a night where there's no fireworks going off would be really nice. And if you're staying in the city, it's pretty much non-stop. It's just non-stop. And so people value those kinds of things, or they value being separated from their neighbors, they value not having to see people, and they value not having to see the mess that we live in. But I don't think any of those are Christian values. They're not things that we hold up as a church. And we devalued a lot of the great things about our faith, and I think they're the ones that impact in our community. So we've found these communities to be exceedingly generous, both fiscally generous and generous in the idea of grace. A friend of mine has put in one of his books this idea that grace is like water, it flows downhill and pools in the lowest places. And these communities are exceptionally gracious. It's why you're allowed to come in and do working here. It's why you're allowed to walk freely around the community and be part of this life and interaction, because it's incredibly gracious. And so someone like me, this pretty broken person who makes lots of mistakes, screws up all kinds of things, can function much easier in a community like this that is high in grace, because my community accepts me, and the community accepts all these other things around us. And it's a beautiful thing. So as well as being generous fiscally, which we generally find that poor are the ones who give the most as a percentage of their income, it's also generous in grace. And that'd be one thing I'd encourage you to look for as you hear is this beautiful generosity that exists. We also find it's a safe place because sin is fairly open in urban communities in comparison to suburban communities. And often, again, we've put this image on urban communities as being these dangerous places or these terrible places because the sin is visible. But when you get outside the city, the sin is all there. It's just really well hidden. And so I'll say that I've got an anger issue, and people know I've got an anger issue because you can hear it through the walls of my house, right? Because we've got connected houses. And although I'm lucky, I've just got one connection. But in suburban context, we've created houses that deliberately separate us so that we can get all our sin in a place that no one else can see. So, and I block out know who's got problems and who's got issues and who has challenges because we see it all visually. You get out of the city and you see kind of the opposite. And for some reason, and I don't know where or why exactly we eventuated this, but we've again held up this ideal of this nice, peaceful American dream as being an ideal Christian thing as well, rather than God being in the midst of what would seemingly be chaos, but it's actually quite beautiful, these elements. So we make that choice, and I think we also make a choice as a family to raise our kids where they can see the beautiful aspects of diversity and be in seeing more culture, although our community is not terribly diverse within the African American community, although most of my work has been in the Latino community. My girls and my son, I think, my oldest daughter's Puerto Rican, all my other kids were the only Caucasian in their grade at school, so they've quite a different experience. My middle daughter went to college. That was the first time in her life being in a class with another white student. So they've experienced some of those dynamics, but I think what it's created for them is to see a far greater strength in culture than maybe has been the usual experience for Caucasians in the US. So we hope that changes and shapes the way they think about life and the way they see life. Just a little about kind of our point to there and our point to the city. Your experiences these next couple of weeks, right, it's going to be a bit different than others have been. It's different than being on the streets and different than being here. Is it right, Holly? You're going to be working more on patient surveys and things like that? Yeah, it's just a little different.
People can be hospitable over the phone.
They can be.
Let you talk.
They can be, yeah. There is a very strong in-person culture. It's a culture that prefers to be in person and prefers to be close to people in distance. So with I guess having less community interaction and probably a little different than previous groups have had for SMI, I think one area to encourage is as you're communicating and as you're interacting, whether it's here or whether it's in the broader community, to be asking that question all the time of the person that you're interacting with and that you're talking to, what is it that they have that I need in my life? So, most people probably have some familiarity with 1 Corinthians, or 1 Corinthians as we do say in Australia, but 1 Corinthians 13, we've got this beautiful passage of what love is, but preceding that is a beautiful passage in 1 Corinthians 12 about what it means to be one, to work together as one, to be unified. And in that, Paul writes, there are two things that you can't say. So he's giving commandments of two things we can't say. One is that I can't say I don't need you, and two is I can't say that you don't need me. Right? So that we have to have this interdependence. And what we've tended to find with people coming into communities like this is that they're coming with this idea of I've got something that you need, I'm going to give it to you. And often we've had that as being Jesus. And I've always thought it's kind of this supreme arrogance we have as though I own Jesus and I can give him to anybody else, right? Like, Jesus is free to do whatever he feels like doing. He doesn't need me in the picture. In fact, it doesn't need me in the picture in any case, in anything I do. We function quite well without him. In fact, I think maybe the world can be better without some of us anyway. So in your interactions, to be asking that question of what does that person have that is a need in my life? What is it they give? What is it their story? How do I acknowledge their presence and the beauty that they have when perhaps the rest of society has said that they don't have those beautiful gifts and they don't have that beautiful presence? And in the same way, how do I put off some of those things that I've had about being the person that's coming in and going to fix people and change people and make things better, and say maybe that's not always my role. It's this interdependent role that takes place. And I think with the people who are more aware of their brokenness, that will become a greater and greater challenge, but also more ability to do in that aspect. If that is making some sense. sorry, I'm pausing a little because I'm trying to think about what can be relevant without just saying things just to annoy you or frustrate you or give you something challenged on. So this time, and some of you will be aware of this, right? If you've been around these communities, others would be, maybe this has been a little new, but the area you're going into, particularly Kensington, Allegheny, that community is, I mean, for 20 years I've said it couldn't get worse, and every year it's gotten worse. And it rivals the worst conditions I've seen anywhere in the world. I've traveled to a lot of poor countries and poor places, but what's going on in Kensington at the moment is kind of tops the list about problems and problem things. And it's fascinating to have watched what's gone on and how people from the outside have treated it and how people have dealt with this thing. And, you know, I expect to get down and see our new location there, which we were intentional about getting the biggest building and making a statement that this was our community and that we want to invest here and that we want to invest for the people of the community. And so that's why we have something kind of right on the center point of where the challenges are. But it's also a really fascinating place to study, and obviously all of you got some kind of a studious background and must enjoy studying at some level to get to where you're at. It's just, I mean, you can see the whole dynamic of the US and the church playing out in that community. So you've got what was, when I first arrived, that was a white neighborhood, and I worked on the Puerto Rican side of that neighborhood, and it was a very tense place. There were battles back and forth all the time over race, violent battles back and forth. And then the Puerto Rican community pushed across, elements of the African American community leapfrogged over and landed kind of in the middle there. So you've got a black Puerto Rican community, and the white community moved out almost completely. And then you had this shift in the opioid issue that took place over the last 10 years, but particularly over the last 5 years, which has been more publicized, the movement of people from using prescription pain medication into using heroin. And that community has been the center point. It's got the highest overdose rate of any of the major cities in the country by far. It has the most pure heroin on the street. It's got the cheapest heroin on the street, so all those things kind of play. And it has the largest open-air drug markets in the US. They're all within that little section. And so you had this influx of people coming into that neighborhood who had an addiction from somewhere else, like not from that community, but coming from outside. And so you've got some people with addictions from that actual community, but a big portion come in from outside. And they've come in initially looking to buy prescription medication on the street, and then found that heroin is cheaper. Maybe switched to heroin and then remained in that community. In a 12-month period, the homeless population in there living on under the L and around that area went from 150 to over 750. I'd say it's over 1,000 at this point in time. For an area that's not a downtown area, that's incredible rate. Overdoses have gone, continue to go up, overdose deaths through those communities. What's quite fascinating has been that the majority of people who are living on the street are Caucasian. They're not African American, they're not Latino, they're Caucasians. And so there's a question of where do they come from and why do they end up in that community, and how does that, what does that say about what's going on in the society and in the culture on a larger scale? And part of it points to the grace of communities like that say, okay, even though when the black and brown population wanted to move into that community, it was met with violence to stop them moving in. When the white community is expelling its unwanted people, they're most likely to end up in black and brown communities. So you're in a suburban context, the epitome of kind of good American Christianity, and you don't fit in anymore because you've got an addiction, maybe you've got some criminal element going on in your life. And so that community expels you, and it expels you sometimes physically through arrest, but sometimes just has no place and no services for you, nothing for you to do. So you get expelled from that community, and where do you end up? Well, you end up in a community like Kensington. It's said, one, because that community has high grace, and two, because it doesn't have a choice. Those communities don't have a choice about who gets to live there and who doesn't. Right? And we've seen that particularly through the COVID stuff, that the police have pulled back out of those communities, which has left anybody else to run the nature of the neighborhood. So you've got this large population. Like in my community, as I said, my community is a black community, but the majority of people asking for money, in fact, everybody I see asking for money in my community on the street, those who seem homeless and those who have visible addiction on the street are all white through my neighborhood as well. So much so that my youngest daughter one day commented, she goes, "Dad, my neighborhood's getting worse." I said, "Well, it is, but what's your indicator? How do you think about this?" And she goes, "Well, Dad, I see white people on the street." Right? That's the image of what means a deteriorating neighborhood, is seeing the white people coming in on the street. So you've got these factors going on. And then the question is, where is the church and where has the church been and how does the church interact? And what we saw was that churches come in from outside. So you've got local churches like Bethel and Spirit and Truth across here and One Hope and others that they're at capacity anyway, trying to deal with the community. But then you have churches from outside who come in, and they come in and think about food on the street. And that might be the place they begin. And you'd say, well, that seems really good, right? I mean, people are hungry, let's give them food. But they come in and they give out food and then they go back home again. They don't ask the neighbors about how they feel about them coming in to give out food. They don't ask the children in the community how they feel about them giving out food. They just come in, they set up their tables, and then they go home again. And they feel really good because I just gave somebody a meal. But the community, through these times, actually begins to get worse. Every time that you come and give something away for free in a poor community, it tends to attract people from other communities to come in, right, because stuff is free. It attracts other problems. It doesn't usually work in regards to the actual neighbors. The neighbors don't control what's going on. They don't get to say, well, we want it on this corner or this corner. The people who come in don't walk away changed because they don't actually have to really give up anything as they come in. They just get to come in, do their good deed, and go back away again. And so those communities decline. We've tracked Kensington for over 20 years now, and we found that the more people that came in from the outside to help, the worse the community has gotten over time. And that's why you see big debates at the moment about things like the safe injection side, where everybody else who doesn't live in Kensington, who thinks safe injection is a reasonable way of treating people, would say put one in Kensington, right? That's the best place to put it. But the people in Kensington would say, no, actually, we really don't want a safe injection site here because it attracts people from everywhere else. So we've already got enough to deal with, right? We really don't need all the addicts from the rest of the city moving into our community for this issue. But at the end of the day, they have very little voice in what goes on. The same as they have very little voice when it comes to who comes in to serve and how they interact with that service. And so the church has been really complicit to this piece because the church has created, and by this I would say the evangelical church in particular, has created this ideal that it's a good Christian thing to do is to go and serve somewhere else and then return back to the place you've come from. Right? So this whole idea of short-term missions, the whole idea of going in and doing service and coming back again. It began really through the 1960s, really picked up in the 1990s. The last data I saw, 6 million Americans do short-term mission trips a year. The cost is about $1 billion a year. And there is no statistic that has been published that says that has made any change in the world, any data that shows that we've solved any problems. And so some of us would say the reason we haven't solved any problems is because you don't have to really do a whole lot in doing that mission. Like giving up a week or two and going and do something and then returning back to your place isn't really a big deal. This came up with some of my students recently who were coming down to Philly for protests. And so it's nice that you're coming in to protest, but what are you doing? You're protesting against the police, and then you're going back to where you get really good policing. I'm like, what did you give up? Like for a few hours you gave up, maybe it was inconvenient, you had to walk around the streets and it was hot and people shouted stuff, and then you just went back home and enjoyed all your privilege that you had before you came in again. And that's a part of this dynamic, is that we've created a system where, I like to describe it like a wall, right? So we talk a lot about the southern border wall that the current government's trying to build. And a lot of churches who support building that wall are also actively engaged in ministry on the other side of the wall, whether it's in Mexico or in Central America. Why would they do that? Why would they say, well, we want to build a wall, but we still want to help you on the other side? It's because we want to help people in a way that never actually makes our life uncomfortable. And we have that in Philadelphia. So we've got this policing wall, and it's a real thing that exists. If you see older maps, you'll see redlining, and you maybe heard of that idea of mortgage companies, banks making lines about what to do. But that exists within policing. So police act differently in different communities and prevent certain kinds of crime being committed in one community versus another. So crime that can take place in my community cannot take place in Center City without a stronger police presence. Right, so, through these neighborhoods, if you call the police, say if you get in a car accident out here and it's a Friday evening and you call the police, most likely they'll never come. Right? It's not, you don't have the expectation that the police will come to deal with any crime. I can't remember the last time a police officer came when I called them for any crime in our area. So they've created this kind of barrier, and churches enjoy that barrier from the outside, and Christians enjoy that barrier. I can have my kids in a nice, what I think is a nice safe school, and I can go live in my nice community, and I can enjoy all these things, and then I'll come in once a week or once a month or once a year, and I'll do really nice things to these people down here, and then I'll come back into my own community. And then we wonder why there's no transformation that takes place between the communities, because there's not an ongoing interaction, there's not a high-level sacrifice that takes place. I work for an institution that is, again, that has done, kind of conducted the same kind of thing, right? So my work is, my classroom used to be next door here, but my university is based 15 miles outside the city. Or 15 miles from my house, I guess maybe 5 miles outside the city, 10 miles. And it is the perfect American suburban community, right? So you go in there, there's trees and big houses and expensive and everything's good, and we've got security guards on campus to make sure that the unwanted people don't come in. And I remember one day saying, wouldn't it be great if we've got this big cafeteria where people can get food, and wouldn't it be great if we had a day when our students can give away their meal to people who are hungry? Like, wouldn't that be just a remarkable thing for a Christian to do, to give their food away? And then we spent with this response of, well, we can't have that because we can't just have people coming on, right, and eating meals on our campus. Like, that would be unsafe. Like, yeah, can you imagine, right, actually, like, as Christians, putting ourselves in a place where somebody who's hungry came into my house and ate a meal with me? Like, we kind of act the opposite of what we say that we should do from Scripture. And I think that maybe that's what's been challenging for some of the SMI groups before, is this pushback on saying that you have to be really careful with doing short-term work, with coming back feeling like you've done something that's made a difference, if that's the extent of what you've done. Now, I think the SMI is quite different than most short-term missions, and that's part of why I've enjoyed interacting over the years, because it fills a specific need that exists within the community. But it's also kind of, for me, right on this borderline where it can perpetuate this issue where those who come from outside the city have the answers, and they're going to come in and do things for those in the city, yet 10 years, 20 years, 30 years on, those communities in the city still are struggling with those same issues. Still haven't seen that same transformation take place. Because those who come in don't go back changed about how they're going to do life. And they go back and assimilate back into the culture that they came from. Which is always kind of a challenge with what we do. Right? It's like, you go away, you have a great experience, we come back and say, yes, that changed us, but we pretty quickly go back to enjoying those same things that we had before. We don't want to make those changes. I was thinking this week when I was seeing a few of the court cases taking place around the country for churches to open up and saying, let's fight for the right to meet on a Sunday. it's like, yeah, wouldn't it be great if we fought for the right to go and serve people all the year round? Like, that would be a really great right to fight for. Wouldn't it be great if during this COVID stuff, volunteerism went up and giving went up? But it's been the opposite. Quickly, volunteerism dried up in the city. In fact, the food banks had to close and continue to close at different points in time because there's no one coming in to pack food. And as you saw, hoarding took place really quickly. And I don't think Christians were exempt from that. It's like, well, let's make sure I hoard enough so that I have enough, instead of saying, let me make sure that I'm more generous in this time. So we've shown kind of the opposite, and then we begin fighting to say that we want to get together on a Sunday, which I think tends to be more of an entertainment time rather than an actual transformation time for a lot of churches. Again, this I think is highlighted that we've done quite the opposite of what we've been called to do as believers. And then the protests, I think, have heightened this through some of these communities as well, to say, the church is again being, you see the divide taking place at a greater rate, when it should be the opposite. How many people are thinking, how do I give more, how do I do more, how do I help more? Or are people more thinking, how do I protect myself, how do I protect what I have, how do I make sure that no one else gets what I have? Which I think is the opposite of what we're being called to do from the gospel point of view. So our community has, the decline just gets worse and worse, which I think is what sparks some of the anger, some of the looting, some of the things that I think maybe weren't the smartest choices, although they're fairly understandable. Right, so I got a stimulus check directly deposited into my account, which maybe many of you did. I don't know if you got them from your students, but happened really quickly, right? And yet I had no real need. My family didn't have any real need. We both maintained our jobs. But people in these communities, if you haven't filed a tax return, well, you're not going to get a COVID check. If you don't have a bank account, then it's going to be mailed to you, and what are you going to do with a mailed check if you don't have a bank account? You take it to a high-charging check cashing place. But that takes 6 or 8 or 10 weeks to get, versus those who have it directly deposited within a week. The whole concept of stay-at-home orders is really nice if you've got a nice home, but if you don't, it's pretty horrible. If you've got savings, if you've got stores of supplies, if you've got a place to store the supplies, like they're really good things. But the poorest people in the country don't have those things. And so these just disadvantage that poor even more. And again, instead of the church being one to really step into that space and say, okay, we're going to give more and we're going to do more, it's gone the opposite direction. I spoke to a church the other day that has about 4,000 people come on a Sunday to their church and open. And they said, yeah, we had somebody come to our door the other day and ask for food. It's like, that's it? Like you had one person come to your door and ask for food. We're seeing small churches in this community, do 50 or 100 boxes of food a week to try and get to families. This divide just gets created bigger and bigger. And so it's kind of what you're stepping into in this case, right? So it's tension. Some of that tension is boiling over to do with race. Some of that is just due to classism. Some of that is to do with communities that have been under-resourced for so long. Just saying enough's enough, right? Like everybody else got their stimulus check, maybe now we're going to go and take our own stimulus checks. And usually it doesn't come out in a totally healthy way, but that's that feeling and that sense. As I say, the church kind of has been, I think, very absent from this conversation, except to say we have the right to meet on Sunday, or we have the right not to wear masks, or we have these pretty abstract rights in comparison to what's taking place in the communities around us. So, yeah. Holly, are there specific things you want me to go from that angle, or it's a bit scattered, I know, I'm sorry.
That's all right. No, I think, did you mention, just the interesting, we come in to communities like this, but why don't we see, what would we think of people coming from Philly, coming to minister in like suburban communities? I always thought that was an interesting thought.
Yeah. So in the 1960s, a guy, Ivan Illich, was writing he got to speak to a group of just all short-term missions who were heading to Mexico, and I don't know why they asked him to speak. They must not have done any background on what he was going to say, but his talk was entitled "To Hell with Good Intentions." Like, I'm sick of people with good intentions coming in and destroying communities. And in one of his comments was, he said, if you tried to do this in the inner city of America, they would run you out of those communities. And I was like, well, that's really fascinating. So this was written pre-civil rights. And what took place after the civil rights movement, one of the challenges was that a lot of the leadership of inner city communities also moved out of those communities. And so you've got once this grace, but also this lack of power that allows people to come in. And it tilted this idea and became almost exclusively people who have stuff, fiscally have stuff, become the ones who do short-term missions to those who don't have stuff. Right? And that's what missions has become globally from the evangelical perspective. So we did a study last year. We went back through some history, and you guys may know this, but for about 200 years, close to 200 years, the American Christian history books talked about the first missionaries that left the US to do overseas missions was a group out of Boston, a white group. But in fact, the first missionaries who left America were both African Americans, former slaves, both came out of the South, and both began this. It wasn't until 2016 that history books began to be corrected on this fact. So we found the first movement of missions out of the US was black-led, and then it switched over to being white as power structures changed and got more and more entrenched. And that, again, just continued over time until missions became about economic prosperity, right? So if you're in a high economic group, then you go to a lower economic group to do missions. It's rare that anybody does missions to a higher economic group. And so we've kind of made this big push. And so what that's meant is that those who have money become the dictator of what missions looks like. And again, we followed the societal idea. So, if a church is a wealthy church, then it must be good at doing ministry, which I think tends to be probably the counter. If we break it down and say most wealthy churches are pretty lousy at doing ministry. Good at entertaining you for a few hours, good at kind of building big buildings, but not sure good ministry. So this mission has been this way, and again, when studied, this guy out of Wheaton who's done a lot of work on this, said that almost exclusively when people talk about missions, they talk about need, but they talk about it from a physical point of view. So I remember 1 year being in Guatemala and having a group of students who were in a cemetery that overlooks the garbage dump. And you're seeing some extreme poverty, and I had students who were crying, and they're like, Dr. Coz, can't we go and help these people, and can't we, tell them about Jesus and help change their lives? And it's like, no, it's not our place, it's not our calling to do this. And so then later on that day, we went to a really nice mall up on the hill, and my students were having a great time. They're drinking coffee, no tears, everything's good. It's like, so where are your tears now? Why have you associated poverty with a lack of spirituality? Why have you associated poverty as being a sign that you don't know Jesus? Like, it's crazy. I mean, our university does this thing every year where they bring up kids from the city and they tell them about Jesus on a campus. I'm like, first of all, if those kids' families didn't know anything about Jesus, they wouldn't let you take their kids. They're just not giving away their children. It's because they've got a trust and a respect for the church that they let you practice on their children. But why aren't you doing that door-to-door in your own communities? Because your own communities don't let you. Your own communities don't want to acknowledge their own brokenness. So they say, let's go and talk about another place that's more broken. And this is I think most countries probably have this, but the US is quite heightened in this. The US is really good at talking about places that are worse off. Like the COVID thing says that really well. These other places are really terrible. I laughed today that a friend said, well, I heard there's a new outbreak in Australia. I was like, yeah, it's really terrible. They had 70 new cases. That's 70 new cases. But it was quick to make the news that, Australia's doing poorly because it's 70. It's like, it's good, right? It's good to think that somebody else is worse than you are. And so missions has followed that trend. Let's go to these people because they look worse than us. What that's done is taken away these incredible gifts that exist in communities like ours. So if you want to know how to deal with people with opioid addictions, these communities will be able to give you a really good idea. If you want to talk about open sin and how to deal with the brokenness in your heart, these communities are great at doing that. But the outside communities, it's difficult to accept that somebody from a community like this could teach you anything, could have anything to do with your life. So when we created the Urban Ministry Program, one of the ideas was to move away as a university from this idea that we're going to have students come in and serve the city and fix the city, because that's never going to work, to let students come in and see what was going on in the city and learn from the leaders in the city and to understand this dynamic. And within the first year, we saw through a series of things, I guess I got confronted that I would look at a group like coming in, right? So if you're medical students, then I've got to think that you've got your lives together and you must have had a pretty good life and you've probably got things going on and you probably come from some pretty good privilege, and so I would automatically stereotype you as being a good person and having everything together and needing very little of my help in that part of your life just to change you to be more socially just and biblically just. And what I came to see through that first year was that my students were exceptionally broken. They had real trauma in their lives, but they had no place to express that. And student after student, and this continues 8 years in, who will come and say, I've never told anybody this before. And I'm thinking, you grew up in a Christian family, went to youth group all your life, go to this good suburban church, go to a Christian university, and you profess as the first person you're telling that you were sexually abused, or that you struggled with depression, or that you wanted to kill yourself yesterday. Like those things, I was like, how do you make it this far in a Christian community and never have anybody that you feel safe expressing that to? And that heightened this idea that like, wow, like at least in our community, we can talk about that stuff. Right? We can talk about people's brokenness, and I can talk about my brokenness because I'm free to do that. Right? You can look around and see, like, we live in a really broken world. It's easy. We're not pretending. And so these beautiful gifts that we have here don't get used much outside because the outside communities don't want to acknowledge their own brokenness, their own sin nature, their own failings. Because that doesn't follow too well the American dream. And it doesn't follow too well the American evangelical dream that we've got it all together and we can go fix all these other places. Which is again why I think coming in you can really have the opportunity to learn from people about how they've dealt with things, how they see grace working, how they develop resilience. Communities like this have extremely high resilience rates. I look at what people go through, friends I've got, and I'm like, I can't imagine spending a week in your life, let alone the last 20 or 30 years, right? It's resilience. There's a sense of family and sticking together, even in the chaos, those things exist. There's a sense of looking after children in our community, which again can look really strange from the outside. And people can say, well, they don't have a high value on children. I was like, no, actually, there's incredibly high value on children. When was the last time you heard about a mass shooting at a school in a city? They don't happen. That's a suburban American ideal, is shooting children in a school, going into a place and doing that. That stuff doesn't happen in cities. When kids get killed in the city, it's accidental. Shootings, crossfires, things like that, right? But it's not a deliberate act. It's kind of like the prison system. And the worst offense to be incarcerated for, right, is child abuse, because prisons have a sense of code, right? You can't touch children. You leave them alone, and that's a similar thing that exists. And again, they can be hard to understand from outside because it can look so dysfunctional that people can miss that stuff. I don't know if you guys have any questions. Again, sorry, it's a little jumping around, but I'll blame it on this dynamic of everybody sitting out. It's not terribly true.
We're running short of time, guys. If you have questions, it's a good time to ask them.
I feel like I haven't heard you say anything controversial yet. So is that kind of what you usually talk about in the gist?
No, I think I'm a little harsher usually.
I think one thing did disagree with Coz when he talked about I think he once said there's no point in short-term missions, which I disagree with because I was one of those suburban kids who went on a short-term missions trip, and it really challenged my whole way of thinking, and I couldn't stop thinking about it after I came back, and it was because it started like a snowballing of I did that and then went on to do something else, which led to something else, which kind of to this day led to why I work at this position, this job, which makes me question every purchase I make, and the way I live my life and how I tithe, and I think God used that. Maybe you could just say, well, God was working on your heart. He would have done it another way anyway, even if you hadn't gone on that trip. I don't know, but I know that trip had value for me. So I believe there's worth it in short-term trips.
Yeah, I would just quickly say that I tend to put Holly into what we call the Michael Jordan effect. It's like, hey, you can get cut from your high school basketball team and still be the best basketball player ever. It's like, well, we know Michael Jordan because he was the one, right? There's not many. And I think in that, for me, becomes this question of what's the cost in my community and what's the cost to people in my community. And I'll say that, I didn't tell this part of my story, but I participated in short-term missions. Initially led a lot of groups coming into Philadelphia and then had to do a lot of repentance on that. And I'd say, just quickly, the story that came out of that was I was speaking at a church in Michigan, spoke about what we do in the city, our work. We were getting some national attention for some work at the time. Got a standing ovation from a white church. I had some young Puerto Rican friends with me. I'm kind of on top of the world. A friend of mine, Cindy, comes up and she's like, "Coz, you know why they love you so much?" I'm thinking, this is the greatest day of my life, right? The suburban white church loves me, my community loves me, I'm brilliant. And she goes, "Coz, they love you so much because they think so little of me." She goes, "You are their hero because you work with people like me. What do you think that does to me and my community?" And that began for me a long period of repentance about the way I had thought about that, right? Being heroic because I work with people in a community, and so how diminishing is that to that particular community in that place? And that just only intensified as I had kids who've grown up here and been treated that way from outsiders. All my girls will tell stories about how outsiders have come in and treated them like they're stupid, like they can't function, like they just need their help to do anything like that. These people who last a day on the street, how dumb are they? But that's kind of that church aspect, and that's a Christian aspect. It's not as much in other groups, but
yeah, I was just gonna. I appreciate your talk. It's very eye-opening, sincerely, and I wanted to get your opinion on, what you talked about how when you go into places of affluence, oftentimes they might not be receptive, to whatever ministry you're providing, compared to lower socioeconomic areas. But isn't that kind of what we're supposed to do, as a church? So I'm thinking about the scripture where it's if these ones don't hear you, go to those who will hear you, when it comes to the ministry of the gospel. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd say to a point. I mean, because otherwise, right, what we end up doing is making poor community our dumping grounds for our feeling good about ourselves, right, and doing things because it's hard work elsewhere. And I also think we've always got to, so the physical and spiritual for me go together. You can't separate the two. And there's some great writing that's come out recently, I think is helping some of us express what we've been trying to say around this area, which is that any gospel we present that doesn't talk about your present need right in this moment is not the real gospel. And others would push back on that, but be happy another time to support why I think that, right? So anything that says, I want you to pray a prayer so that when you die you go to eternity is not the gospel. The gospel deals with our here and now all the way through. It's not just for the future. And I'd say that if I rarely think about dying and going to heaven, but I didn't accept Jesus because of some promise of getting into heaven when I die, right? And I don't know about how many of you sit and think the greatest news is that sometime in the future I'm going to die and I get to go somewhere else. But the great news to me is that I'm going to go home and get a loving wife and loving kids and food and a place to sleep and community, and that Jesus relieve me of these incredible burdens and set me free on this earth right now to live out for him. Not some future promise. And I'm not saying the future promise isn't part of the gospel, but we've pushed it to being so much about that's what the gospel is, that we miss this here and now, right? What was good news when Jesus said, I've come to set you free? It's like, people are thinking right now. They're not thinking, I get to die. Like, otherwise, why wouldn't we just all kill ourselves? Right? Really, like, if that was the best I've got to is when I die, then I might as well just end my life now. So I think they're separated. So I think we are called to help people in the physical, but I also think that we've got to be able to be reflective of why we don't also spread it in other areas. And again, do we just use the poor to make ourselves feel better about things without doing lasting change? And again, that's what I think a lot of us are frustrated right now is it's great protests are taking place. I actually think some of the stuff that's been more disruptive is really good. I think protest has to be disruptive. The idea of protest that is not disruptive seems pretty ridiculous to me. And I laugh too, because on the weekend, what was it, your 4th of July holiday for those Americans in here? Like, that's a celebration of violent protest. So not that I agree with violent protest, but just certainly disruptive protest. But how many of the people are actually going to be sacrificial in getting that disruptive protest? I remember asking students one day, a large group of students, like, how many of you believe that universities should do more to scholarship students from poor communities? Every hand goes up in the room. How many think that's good justice? Every hand goes up in the room. How many of you would like to now donate your scholarship money that you get for those students? Every hand goes down, right? Because justice comes at a cost if you have power. So if I want to see justice, then I have to be willing to give up some of my power and some of the privilege that I hold. And so that's our fear at the moment, is there's a lot of people who are protesting, but how many of those people from outside are actually willing to give up their power and their privilege in order to see lasting change take place? That's certainly something I'm not real confident about, because we haven't seen that.
I have a question. You kind of touched on it a bit here and there, but for future references, you're looking to go on missions or a short-term mission or even a long-term mission. What would you say is maybe a checklist, if you will, of things you should think about or you start praying about, before you start just jumping on a plane and going somewhere, just because you may have saw something in church or saw an article or whatever have you?
Yeah, I think one is to find out wherever you're going is how much is the local population involved in decision making of the areas, and how much is it excluded. So is the place I'm going, is it led community oriented? It's one of the things about Esperanza that it's positive. I mean, there's many positive things, but one of the things is that our board has to be made up of community members, and at least half of our board has to be patients. So our job is to represent the community, and our board represents that quite well. But in most missions, the community doesn't make decisions, right? And this is a problem with nonprofits across the country, around the world, is that if I own a nonprofit and my goal is to build houses, you give me money to build a house. I build a house, and then you say, well done, and I feel good. But no one actually measures what transformation took place in who gets that house, nor does a homeowner normally get any choice in that. So I say, this is your house. Or I say, this is your food box. Or these are the clothes that I'm going to give you. Usually my used clothes, right, that I don't want anymore, or my used toys that I don't want anymore. That's what I'm going to give you. But you don't get the choice. We've taken away that choice. So I look for places where the local community gets to make those decisions. Do we want you? If we had a choice, would we take you? For missionaries, it's a challenge. A friend of mine once said, he goes, there's a mixed church in Chicago. He's Puerto Rican. He goes, we always have a white pastor because we can't pay enough, and white people can raise money. He goes, but if we had that money, would we choose a white pastor? He goes, probably not. And that's a lot of missionaries, right? It's because it's being overwhelmingly, missions money in the US goes to white people, anywhere in the world. So, and it's crazy from a strategic point of view. I would not if I had all the money and I could hire people to work all around the world, I would not hire white Americans as being the predominant group that I would put all over the world. I just wouldn't do that. They're not the best culturally understanding other places. Right? I would hire people who were local to those contexts. But because white churches don't trust non-white people, they give their money just to white people. And the numbers, I may say the numbers are overwhelming. We've just finished research on this, and it's staggering the amount of money and where it goes out of the white church. So I'd look at those kinds of dynamics, and I would ask that question. I'd say to a local group, hey, instead of my airfare and what it's going to cost me to be here on the ground, at my living level, which the poorer place you go, the greater the disparity is between a white American missionary and the local community. So a white American missionary working in France or in England is usually a little bit below what people would normally make. But when they're working in Haiti or Zimbabwe, they're extreme above what a local community member makes. And I'd ask people, hey, if I gave you this $50,000, would I be the person you'd hire? Or would you do something different with that money? Instead of us taking a trip of 20 people to South Africa and spending $40,000 just to fly there, is there something you would like to do with that $40,000 instead of us coming over here for our 2-week experience? Putting the power back in the hands of local people, beginning with financial decisions. That's kind of where I'd normally start with mission stuff. Unfortunately, right, there's a big system that makes that hard to do, because churches tend not to be wanting to give money to local people. They give it to people who look like them and function like them. And that's quite a challenge. So, as we find here, throughout our community, it's the same challenge. And so the organizations are not held accountable to the people who live there. The same as non-profits are not held accountable by the people who live there. They're held accountable by the people with money, but not the recipients. And that becomes, just tricky all across the things we do. We've tried to make some changes through our community. I'm really against giving away anything unless somebody is right at the point of not being able to survive without something. So I think everything we do at Esperanza has some kind of cost. Patients pay for things. Food stuff, like to have people pay for food, not be given, but also give them choice. So things like farmers markets, you can pay for it. Got into an interesting conversation with a guy who was giving away food. He gives away over 1 million pounds of food a year. Wanted to do some stuff in Philly. We said, great, we'll help you, but you've got to play by the rules that we think our community wants, which is you don't give it away for free. He said, no, we only do free. So he went away, and then Bob Lupton had written some great stuff out of Atlanta. Got to meet Bob, and Bob's first thing was like, never give it away. And so he came back, and so now we have multiple fresh farmers markets that begin pretty soon. Clothing, again, let's get people, if you want clothes, then let's give you choices of clothes. Toys, my wife and some others made a big shift 20 years ago to no longer give toys away to children. So every year we create a toy store. I think last year we did about $25,000 worth of toys. Families come in, they might only pay 5 or 10% of what the price is on the toy, but they're new toys. They get to shop for their own toys and give their own toys to their kids. Because what they found was the idea of me coming in and giving somebody else's kids toys was destructive to the family.
It's emasculating.
Absolutely is. It said, why? But it feels good for me because I feel like Santa Claus. All the kids love me. I'm great. But we destroyed the family structure, and so instead, they get to pick the toys. Grab the toys, give them to their kids. They don't even know I exist. Did you have another question? So I know we're out of time here. I think. Good luck for your week. 2 weeks. I do appreciate you guys coming in. Despite what some of that might sound like. And happy during the week to process and people do have things. I would really encourage you to be processing the current climate, particularly the race climate, and having open, honest conversations. They tend not to be happening too well right now. But I have far more hope in your age group than my age group is doomed. It's not changing. And as I find with students, most of my former students now, their struggle is in their parents. And they're just like, what do? I was like, I don't really have much advice. If somebody's over about mid to late 20s, then I'm like, it's pretty unlikely that they're going to be making major shifts in how they see the world based on race. Not saying the Holy Spirit can't do miraculous things, we pray, but there's so much invested in the system that for me to realize that I've got 30 years of mistakes and repent of that is much harder than for you guys to realize you've got 2 or 3 years of mistakes and repent of those.
I've seen a real generational thing in the church as well, because I go to a multi-generational church, and there's a divide. I mean, the folks maybe over 50, both African American and white, the African Americans are used to taking it, so they're just going to let it roll off and going to make, small steps, small steps, small steps. Let's tell the white folks what they want to hear, small steps, small steps, small steps. Anybody under 35 is out there protesting. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, you guys need to, I mean, come on, people. There's the generational shift, the generational divide is almost as bad as the racial divide. It seems like that this generation, 35 and under, are kind of getting it. Whereas the older folks, they see and they want to repent, quote unquote, but they don't see the scope.
Yeah.
They're going to repent of their own individual little slights and things and thoughts and slips, but they don't see the big repentance picture. I mean,
Yeah.
societal.
Yeah, I would say my non-white friends are in mourning at the moment and in pain, and we talk about that. And I don't have a lot, but my white conservative suburban friends are generally telling me what I need to come in and tell other people in the city how to fix their problems and what they're doing. And they're certainly not coming and asking what do we do to change and how do we do these things differently. Can I pray for you guys? Hey Lord, I thank you. Thanks for the work of your Holy Spirit. It makes no matter how poorly I may speak or communicate, Lord, I have great trust in your work. Lord, I thank you for this group here. I thank you for their sacrifice in this time. Like, Lord, it would have been very easy, and all of them had excuses to say no. Lord, I thank you for that sacrifice they made. Lord, I thank you that they're in community. Lord, I do pray that they can spend time talking amongst each other and learning from each other and being real with each other and expressive of what life has been like from their various perspectives and what life is still like coming forward. Father, I pray for the interactions also with this community, with patients and with staff here. And it can be a time of glorifying your name, but also mourning together, especially, again, this time when things are just really hard. Lord, I pray for their time when they can maybe be just listening to patients on the phone, and whether it's actually doing a survey or just letting somebody tell their own story and feel like they're listened to. Father, I pray for that time. Lord, and I pray for the impact they can have one another. Thanks again, Lord. Thanks that you give us these opportunities in this time. I pray in your Son's name. Amen.